Well, Holly, thanks for coming on to the show today. How are you?
I'm good. A little cold in New Jersey.
hmm And so we came on today to talk about Alexander technique, Tai Chi, and biomechanics. So maybe we start with how did you get into this?
Yes, I got into Alexander technique through the world of dance.
Hmm.
And I was an aspiring professional dancer. I had an undergraduate degree in graphic arts and dance. And I was suffering from tendonitis on a daily basis. And some days it was so bad, I never knew if I would have a plie in me or not.
Hmm.
So I went to medical professionals and they said, take anti-inflammatories,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a limit to how many anti-inflammatories you can take. And it really didn't, excuse me, touch the problem.
Oh.
So I began to seek other solutions, and Alexander technique came up as a recommendation from another professor, actually, at the college where I was studying. And I went to a workshop.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't truly understand what was going on, but there was something in me that said, this is this is real. This is something that I need to explore.
Mm-hmm.
So the benefits seemed obvious, but I didn't understand the path to experiencing those benefits
Yeah.
yet. But I thought this makes the most sense of any solution that I investigated so far. And I actually quit dancing for a year and I moved to be closer to an Alexander school. I moved to the Philadelphia area and I started taking classes at what was then called the Alexander Institute of Philadelphia, run by Martha Hanson Furtman and Bruce Furtman. And taking a year off dance because I didn't think I could do both. I had experienced enough of the Alexander technique from this intensive workshop that realized I totally had to rework the way I was approaching my dance. So it was a little bit of a gamble.
Wow.
So that experience of taking a year off from dance and completely investing myself in learning the Alexander technique was a real life changer for me because I realized, as much as I loved dance, that I was actually more interested in the science of movement
Mm-hmm.
and all the elements that go into coordination and movement and maintaining structure while moving, all those things. So while the Alexander technique was really helpful, and I did return to dance after that year, and I did eventually solve my tendonitis problem,
Oh.
the most important thing was I realized that I wanted to be involved in exploration of movement rather than as the practitioner of movement, as sort of the observer and investigator of movement.
Mm-hmm.
So my life took a different path at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that was curious to me about the Alexander technique, I read Alexander's writings, I listened to my teachers. I had some wonderful teachers who had incredible manual techniques. And the manual techniques actually impressed me so much because a teacher, Marjorie Barstow, was probably the most outstanding in terms of manual techniques. She could just create an all over structural organizational change in a few seconds working with somebody right before your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And I experienced her hands too, and experienced that sudden, complete change of structure. And the explanation for it in the writings of Alexander and the explanations of my teachers, to me, fell short of what I was seeing and experiencing, because the explanations that Alexander gave and that was still part of the teaching was that we were going through the nervous system. This was all a process that was taking part in the nervous system. And I just felt it was too fast to be the nervous system because the nervous system is relatively slow in terms of learning new things and manifesting different coordinations. And this was something almost instantaneous. So this led me to want to investigate this question. So I began to search around for academic programs that might fit the mark. And the closest I could sort of come up with was ergonomics and orthopedic biomechanics at New York University. So they had a graduate program, and I wanted to enroll in it. My background, of course, was graphic arts and dance. So I was way short on the math end of the application. So I began taking math courses at the Borough of Manhattan Community College, which I thought I was going to be doing for the rest of my life. It's not my natural subject, but God bless institutions that exist like that, because I was able to get all the way up to second year calculus with passing grades, with sufficient grades that then my application to New York University was accepted. So I began the graduate program in orthopedic biomechanics and ergonomics. Long story short, this was in the mid to late 90s that I was enrolled. I didn't find an answer to my question there either, but I did gain a lot of useful skills, like understanding how to read scientific papers. I had to take gross anatomy at the New York University Medical School, so my anatomy really got up to speed. So it was a very worthwhile graduate program, but I still had my question.
That's
I
that's
was
that's fabulous that you go to school to get a degree to answer this question from Margie Barstow. I do
right.
have
Well,
a
it's actually my question, but Marge kind of inspired me to investigate how do these manual techniques work? How can they possibly be that fast? And the manual techniques of Alexander technique, of course, are extremely light. Like I love the manual techniques. And in Alexander technique lexicon, we call it directing. So it doesn't involve a forceful manipulation of the body at all, but a very subtle, light technique that just implies a certain direction of movement in certain areas of the body. And as I said, Marge was the master of this. You know, she'd have one fingertip behind your ear and the other fingertip underneath your shoulder blade, and then suddenly your whole body changed. So I didn't have an answer to what was going on there yet. But as I said, I learned a lot more skills, and I began to satisfy this desire I had to understand movement, maintenance of structure, anatomy from a more scientific viewpoint. I was still dancing. In fact, I was teaching ballroom dance while I was in graduate school just because that was something I could do at night.
Mhm.
So during the day, I was at the Hospital for Joint Diseases facility, which was on Downing Street at that time. And then at night, I was on Union Square, backwards in high heels dancing. So it was kind of a wild period where I didn't feel like I really fit clearly into any of the worlds I was participating in. But when you're young, you can get by on less sleep. So it was quite a period of sleep deprivation. Anyway, after that time, or I should say during that time, one of my good friends from the dance world, who actually I met at Alexander Technique School in Nebraska, studying with Marjorie Barstow, he was very involved with Tai Chi. And I had gone to the Tai Chi school in New York that he had attended for many years, and it didn't really captivate me. But in contact with him, he said, you know, there's these two Chinese masters that are coming out of China. They've been invited to the United States for the first time. And I think you might really enjoy checking them out. Like, this is the real deal.
Mhm.
So actually, I was able to do that. And they were coming to a center in Virginia that a woman named Pat Rice had started, oh, probably a decade before that, maybe more, that she called a Taste of China. So she would invite Tai Chi practitioners from all over the states, or anywhere they could come, very high level people. And did seminars there. So it was this Taste of China seminar where Master Yang Zhendoa and his grandson, Yang Jun, came and performed and taught. And again, it was a life-changing moment because they were the most extraordinary movers I had witnessed. And that's saying something because in the dance world, I knew some extraordinary movers,
Yeah.
wonderful. But there was something about the way they were organizing the movement that really captivated me. And I realized, I was watching something that I didn't fully understand.
Mhm.
There was an underlying foundation of movement that they had that I was not familiar with, but it was very conspicuous in their work that was so grounded, so suspended, so agile, so without tension, but so completely full. In other words, their bodies completely down to their fingertips fulfilled every movement they did without any excessive tension anywhere, which of course, as an Alexander technique, you're always really grabbed by that. You don't like excessive tension anywhere. So anyway, that led me to another journey where I began to study Tai Chi seriously with with these two masters from China, including going to China after I finished my graduate studies at NYU. I went to China that summer as kind of my little vacation from academia, and studied for 3 weeks in Shanxi province with the Yang family. And that started me on a very serious trajectory of Tai Chi study, which eventually led to teaching Tai Chi professionally, which I still do.
Mhm.
So the biomechanics was the lens through which I started to look more closely at what was going on with the Alexander technique, what was going on with Tai Chi. But again, I needed more information to really explain what I was witnessing and what was I experiencing in my own body. And that came through studying the new discoveries of fascia, connective tissue, its signaling behaviors, a new way to look at anatomy. So Serge Paoletti and Thomas Myers both became important people for me to study with, and the journey continues.
Mhm. So a question occurs to me. So again, back to Marjorie, doing the hands-on technique to you. Was she showing you and putting you in a position for mechanical advantage or movement that like felt different, felt right? And then afterwards, were you able to replicate it, or was it gone once her hands came off? And was there, if so, is there any explanation of a means whereby given to you to work on it?
Yes, so I appreciate your question very much. And actually, I'll broaden the scope of it a little bit, coming back to F.M. Alexander and some of his aphorisms, which were widely used by teachers who taught his work. And of course, Marjorie Barstow had studied directly with F.M. Alexander. And his aphorisms were always wonderful, and they were sort of these little encapsulations of his technique. One of the famous ones among many is that he said, everyone wants to be right, but no one stops to consider if their idea of right is right.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of speaks to the Alexander perspective that most of us live in the world of our habits, and we're not really observing very closely that what we think we're doing is not actually what we're doing when it comes to performing coordinations and refined actions. So I know that that's kind of what his statement was about. But in my journey of exploration, it kind of has become something else, in that Alexander, of course, was firmly entrenched in the Victorian age. That's the time that he came from and the time that he developed his work in. And at that time, there was a very strong belief that we as human beings were born with some sort of pure, informed state of reflexive behaviors that was the really good stuff. And then as we matured, we kind of screwed ourselves up by doing stupid things with our body and working on assembly lines. And that was a viewpoint that Alexander had, and he wrote about in his books. And it was reflected in the spirit of the times. So his idea of a prime control in the body, which was his viewpoint, if you just don't let yourself perform any habitual movements, if you practice what he called inhibition, don't let that habituated pattern motivate you as you perform a coordination like getting out of a chair, then this other innate pattern will manifest, this primary control will manifest, and your coordination will be well organized, effortless. So that's the underlying belief, yeah, of his work. And there was often in the literature about Alexander technique that other people have written, they cite some scientists who support what Alexander was saying. One of the ones who's often cited is Rudolf Magnus, who performed a lot of experiments on animals to prove that there are these innate reflexes, like the righting reflex. The head will lead, the body will follow. If you throw a cat out the window, the righting reflex will turn the cat in the air and it'll land on its feet instead of its head. If organizations for the ethical treatment of animals had been around during Magnus's time, he would have been out of business because his experiments were quite gruesome. And later, and his experiments seemed to lead one to believe that there were these innate reflexes that caused certain patterns of coordination in animals. Later, his work was debunked when systems theory, this brings us to the 1980s, systems theory became more and more adopted in the way we look at the nervous system and the way we look at how coordinations are formed and behavior is formed. So systems theory is interesting because the environment, of course, we are in constant interaction with our environment. And Magnus's experiments, where he seemed to be able to prove these reflexes, the environments of the animals and their experience were so limited. It was a very artificial situation. So it's not how we live, with lots of different things going on in the environments that we interact with. So systems theory is a much better explanation for how coordinations are formed in our nervous system and how plastic the nervous system is and how it's always going through change throughout our lifetime. So there isn't any kind of bedrock coordinations in our bodies, as it was assumed with Alexander technique and the primary control that there was. But another thing that came out from systems theory, which is quite interesting, is that absolutely practice and repetition is necessary to create new coordinations and new behaviors. So that's kind of the slowness of the nervous system. The nervous system has to myelinate circuits to create these coordinations, and that takes time. And what motivates that myelination, that change in the nervous system where it kind of creates broadband channels, is repetition, repetition, and repetition. But then the other thing that's very interesting is after you have created this new circuit of movement, this new coordination, no matter how complex it is, via practice and repetition, then the whole system becomes more adaptable. So you reach a very high level of performance through practice and repetition, and then you're able to, in the moment, refine, adapt, change because of that bedrock of practice and repetition that created certain coordination. So I find this very interesting for a number of reasons. And it explained one thing, which answers your question. So Marjorie Barstow could get me to move out of a chair like a puff of smoke, but I couldn't do it myself. I couldn't do it without her guidance. So this was very frustrating. So it was years. I studied Alexander technique for years with many teachers, and I didn't feel competent, shall we say, that I was really able to fulfill this balanced, effortless motion. I would say at least 6 years into, very disciplined study of the technique, which I thought that's pretty darn slow. So that experience in my own life led me to look at other systems of learning. And of course, Tai Chi is a very ancient, well-established system of learning. It's a huge tradition of learning. And there's some interesting practices within the Tai Chi, what they call the still practices, which I thought probably have more veracity than the Alexander technique, just because the Alexander technique was based on an idea that's really not accurate. This idea of a primary control that's innate, that we just have to liberate somehow from our bodies.
So then you were introduced to.
So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, very well. That was great. So then you run across Tai Chi, and the first one didn't take, but the second one you met with an authentic teacher, and you saw something there. Okay, you're going to spend your time here. And then you said fascia. So I'm back to my same question as within the Alexander technique. So this idea of the means whereby, so the explanation of the way they were moving, you thought there was an answer in the fascia.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think our understanding of fascia is still just beginning,
Yeah.
but it does have a lot of independence from the nervous system. And the research has shown that fascia is a whole body communication network that's still not fully understood, but there is definitely signaling that occurs through fascia. So my current belief, shall we say, from my studies is our fascia does hold a blueprint of our structure. And this seems to be supported. This idea comes from embryology and the recognition that as structure appears, the first thing that appears is the fascial network and this infolding of fascial sheets that create pathways and channels in which the organs grow. So the fascia seems to be the blueprint. So Serge Paoletti, in his book about fascia, has a really extensive description of this embryological process of development that's really driven by the fascia. So in terms of maintaining a structural blueprint, it would seem that fascia, rather than the nervous system, is where we want to look. And the fascia outside of the nervous system seems to have this volition to maintain structure and to organize structure and to promote healing. One of the very recent discoveries about fascia, which I think is really interesting, is that fascia, of course, is created by fibroblasts. So they kind of create this fibular network. And they've discovered that fibroblasts can turn into other things. And one of the things that fibroblasts can turn into are stem cells. So fascial stimulation of certain kinds can actually create stem cells.
Hmm. That's
And
fascinating.
this is a rather recent discovery. So it seems like the fascia is not only the blueprint, but it's also the construction team that keeps things uh, in shape as best we can, literally in shape. So if we break our collarbone, there's a guidance within our body that will mend the bone if it's not interfered with too severely, pretty much back to the original blueprint, if possibly can. And fascia is used, I know, in wound healing more and more. Fascia harvested from pig bladders, actually, thin dried sheets, applied to huge wounds, like horrible wounds like you experience in the bombing in war and landmines and things like that, that putting the fascial sheet uh, on the wound attracts the body's own stem cells. Like the body recognizes that as something that it can use as a grid work in a way that a bandage or some other material doesn't communicate to the body in the same way. So it stimulates the healing process. So I think going back to the mystery of Marjorie Barstow's incredible manual techniques, I think it was a fascial communication. She was communicating into the fascial matrix in a way that could be listened to and understood in that matrix, and make self-corrected.
But there was no directions for you to do it on your own. That's how to stimulate the fascia from your own internal process.
Right. Well, of course, the fascia and fascia stimulation wasn't on the map when
Right.
Alexander developed his technique.
Yeah.
So he was really working with training the nervous system. So there were instructions that we repeat to ourselves. There was a very important concept of inhibition, um, that, just wait, because if you move without thinking, you're going to do the old habit. You're going to do the old thing, which is fine. But his teaching had a very Zen quality to it. For instance, another one of his aphorisms, which I remember very clearly, he said, "You can't do something you don't know if you keep on doing what you do know." Like those were the kind of things we would examine in terms of uh, mastering the technique. So avoiding doing the habituated familiar pattern and just sort of waiting for something else to happen. So the magic thing was that the primary control would be allowed to kick in, and your head would move forward and up, and your back would lengthen and widen, and you would float out of a chair or whatever movement we're trying to do. That's what we were going for, but the process that we were headed towards, the process that we used to head towards that, was this idea of inhibition, about not doing the familiar movement and just waiting and waiting, thinking about what we wanted to do, but not acting. And as I said, it was a very slow learning process.
Yeah. Yeah. But we do, so the Zen quality and the waiting does bring me back to a Tai Chi practice where there is, those principles seem to be also in that tradition as well. I'm sure the application's a little different, but there is the sense of
Yes.
standing and waiting, not going into habits.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Tai Chi practice, what they call still practice, which is
Mhm.
practiced reclining and sitting and also standing, where you're not moving externally, but you're working internally with yourself to open and extend the structure, allowing long periods of time not externally moving very much. You may be adjusting slightly levels of tension in your body so that you feel it's well distributed, rather than, oh my goodness, my neck is killing me or my shoulders hurt. So you have to find a tensional balance in your body to perform still practice for extended periods of time comfortably, which I think that's the point. You find comfort, which means your body is better balanced, the tensional balance throughout your body is improved. And this is an opportunity that you're giving your structure to self-correct.
Mhm.
I'm really a firm believer that structure will self-correct, self-heal if given the opportunity. And in our lives, when does it have that opportunity? Well, you could say when we're sleeping, but in the Tai Chi view of things, and Tai Chi not alone, kind of an Eastern view of things, that exercise alone is not enough to maintain health. That these other practices, such as meditation and still practices, are necessary, essential, shall we say, to maintaining health. And I think in the Western world, we're understanding more that viewpoint, but it's not very fully embraced. So we have the home gym at home. Many people have the gym equipment, or they go to the gym, but in the gym, there's probably not a meditation room or a still practice room, and in the home there may not be either. So it's still sort of a neglected part of our salutogenesis, shall we say.
So let's go ahead and talk about how we stimulate the fascia in the Tai Chi practice.
Well, I think we're stimulating our fascia all the time, actually. We couldn't avoid doing that. I think I would answer that question. In Tai Chi practice, there are requirements that are pretty precise for what is called body shape, which could be interpreted as posture. I kind of actually have come to like body shape as a little bit, doesn't have the baggage that posture has for most people. So body shape, there's certain ideas of not lifting up your shoulders towards your ears, or not pulling them to the front of your body, position of your spine, lower spine, tailbone, that all of these considerations about maintaining a certain relationships within your structure as you move, that all come back to a concept that's translated as relaxation, sung. But relaxation is, in the Tai Chi sense of the word, is not exactly what our Western use of the term is. So relaxation in Tai Chi is opening and extending. And my teacher, Grandmaster Yangzhen Doa, gave an interesting explanation of relaxation. When a chain is laying on the floor, all the links are sort of just tangled together. But if you pick the chain up in your hand and swing it, all the links extend and straighten relative to one another. He says that's relaxation. So this opening and extending the body from within to create an overall suppleness in the body, as opposed to an overall rigidity or stiffness. Also, not allowing the body to collapse and be limp and formless. That's not relaxation. So this kind of maximal opening and extending of everywhere in the whole body, not limited to one particular thing, is something that one is practicing in the moving practice as well as the still practice. And I think that that property is what initially struck me when I first saw the Tai Chi masters. They had that. They had that ability to open and extend their body in stillness, in movement, evenly throughout their body. It was just something that was so arresting to me. And I didn't understand it then. Now I understand more the practice that led them to that kind of skill. That definition of good body use, which we would talk about in Alexander, the use of the self. I like the Tai Chi definition of relaxation, open and extend the body. And I like the process by which that skill is attained. To me, it's a more holistic process than the Alexander technique presented. Although the Alexander technique is certainly with benefits as a technique to be studied, I think it particularly makes a good match for actors and working with voice quality. In my journeys with Alexander technique, I encountered, oh, sorry, I encountered working with actors and singers, dancers, athletes, and the way that actors think and work and train is very different from dancers and athletes. So I think the Alexander technique really does have a home in theater training. And not coincidentally, of course, because Alexander was a theater person himself and developed the technique from his frustrations with producing good quality voice.
So you talked a little bit about Tom Myers and the large lines, and so can we talk a little bit more about how to work with fascia, what it is? Does it need rest? Do we need to stimulate these fibroblasts? Like, is it all slow movement? Do we also need fast movement? How often do we train? Like, can you sort of paint a picture here of like what is fascia and how do we work with it?
Right. Well, I think that there's a lot of different schools of how to work with fascia. So, for instance, Thomas Myers, you mentioned, he came via Ida Rolf and Rolfing, which is a fairly rigorous manual technique. And then there are other fascial manipulations, for instance, the work of Upledger in cranial sacral therapy that's extremely delicate. I think that there's different ways to work with fascia, and there's probably not just one way. The research of Helene Langevin really demonstrated that acupuncture works with fascia, not the nervous system. And in the West, for a long time, we were looking for a nervous system connection to acupuncture and were frustrated. We couldn't really find the fascial connection is definitely there, and again explains how a needle stuck under your eye can influence something that's going on in your leg. There are different approaches, some of them very, very light touch, which I would say Alexander technique. I regard that now as a fascial technique. It's certainly a light manual technique. The Upledger cranial sacral work, very light technique. The Jean-Pierre Barral manual visceral manipulation, pretty light technique, and then goes all the way to Rolfing. And I would say Thomas Myers manual techniques, very influenced by Rolfing, so they're pretty rigorous. I think the main thing with fascia is to realize that you're never working regionally. You're working with the whole body. And I think that's the most important thing. So I think it's very possible to communicate with light touch and communicate to the whole body. And I prefer light touch techniques personally because I feel that the lighter my touch is, the more information I can take in through my hands, so my listening is better. And if my touch, as it becomes more vigorous, the less information I'm taking in from the other side. That's just my personal preference. So when I do manual techniques, most of what I do, I think, is listening, and that's listening to the other person's body that then informs you of what direction, what communication you wish to put into the system. So in the Upledger system, they call that, everybody has their own inner physician. And if you listen, that inner physician will talk to you and will, kind of guide your therapeutic touch. I like that better than starting off with a technique that's addressed regionally without sort of listening to the whole body first. That's just my preference. The other thing that I would say personally in working with fascia is that stretching techniques for fascia, which you can do yourself, are amazing for their health benefits, for reducing inflammation. Particularly, I use them all the time for that personally. And I have some stretch classes that I've designed that are basically just to promote salutogenesis rather than greater range of movement at a joint. Stretching is generally viewed as creating greater range of movement. There's also stretching that just promotes salutogenesis. So I'm kind of very interested in that. And with my colleague, Patricia Houston, I've been very inspired by her work about how stretching influences the microenvironment, the interstitial fluid microenvironment.
Mhm. And this is a different type of stretching than you would find like in calisthenics or in the yoga class, or same?
Again, I'm not an expert in yoga, so I wouldn't want to speak to any specific stretching technique, other than saying that many stretching techniques focus on increasing range of movement at a specific joint. So like you do these stretches to get more range of movement in your hip joint or your shoulder joint, um, or more range of movement in your spine. Can you do a back bend? Can you touch your toes? And then there's stretching that is not focused on joints, but on opening and extending large areas of the body. So now we come back more to the Tai Chi vision of relaxation, which is actually a form of stretching, but it's not focused on joints. It's really focused on connecting large areas of the body by stretching in a very moderate and subtle way.
So it seems like there's a different application here. It seems like there's a difference between like there's a passive and more of an active form. Like this sounds like what you're suggesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, is more of a isometric contraction kind of engaged
Yeah,
stretch.
certainly duration is an important thing, and bypassing
Mhm.
a lot of muscle work.
Stretch reflex.
Right, exactly. So
Mhm.
sneaking into the stretch. So it's very moderate. So you're not stimulating the stretch, the spindle receptors in the muscles. And by bypassing that, then the muscles relax and you can work with the receptors in the connective tissue, like the Golgi tendon organs and so on and so forth, to elongate connective tissue without creating a muscular response. Yes, I would say that's the kind of stretching that I think is very important for health because of its influence on the microenvironment.
Yeah, this is very much like Thomas Hanna's work. He called this type of movement a pandiculation, and this slow, mindful co-contraction and eccentric release out of the contraction, but while maintaining the structure of the body.
Yeah, I think that's a great description of a
Mhm.
way of working with stretching that is not familiar to most people, I would say. It's
Mhm.
kind of a
Yeah,
different idea,
yeah,
stretching.
yeah. And I feel like you even using the word stretching is a little misleading. it's not really stretching in what people typically think, like in a typical athletic class or yoga class. That's not really what's being
Yeah,
done.
sometimes I use the word traction, which isn't
Mhm.
great either, but at least it doesn't have as much association maybe as stretching.
Yeah.
And kind of a
Yeah. And go ahead.
it
Sorry.
yeah, traction refers to techniques that were used extensively orthopedically for a long time. They've kind of moved away from them, where people would be put in
Mhm.
devices and their neck would be slowly stretched. They've realized not such a good idea, right?
Yeah.
Because it just involved too much force. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and not enough, obviously the thing about the connective tissue, it's meant to be a very resilient environment. So it stretches and rebounds all the time. So you don't want it to lose that resiliency. So it's neither compressed nor overstretched to the point where it can't rebound. Neither of those two
Right.
things are good. So I think
Yeah.
avoiding compression is always a good suggestion when people are stretching,
Yes.
because if the focus is on joints, it's really easy to be compressing one area of your body while you're stretching muscles in another. So again, those
Yeah.
techniques I'm not particularly fond of. So
Mhm.
avoiding compression and also avoiding what I call hot spots in stretching, where you have a very, very regional and intense stretch in one focused area. I think it's much better
Yeah.
to distribute the stretch through the largest area of the body as you can.
Yeah, and when we change our perspective towards these fascia lines or meridian lines, there's a more holistic engagement in the stretch or the pandiculation or the traction, as you say.
Yes, I agree with that, and it's something that I've experienced and witnessed in my students, is that just sustained uh, addressing of the whole body, that there is
Mhm.
this wonderful reorganization and self-correction that takes place very holistically in the body. So in
And when you say
Alexander language, you
sustained,
say,
what are we talking?
just in my experience, I found that 3 minutes is sort of the minimum that you have to sustain that kind of stretching for at least 3 minutes for something to happen. And of course, it can be sustained longer, but less than 3 minutes, more likely that something will not be very apparent that something's happened. And I think this is somewhat mechanical in that all stretching is applying a certain tensional force. So all the tensional forces in that tensional structures in that area, the stretch will be conveyed through them. In the case of connective tissue like tendons, the fibers will straighten more, going from wavy to straighter, elongating. And that just takes time. And the other component of this, which is not really understood at this point, but suspected, is that there's some kind of fascial communication that occurs through the whole network of the body. We don't really know what it is yet, but it just seems that it's there, hence the effect of acupuncture, hence the effect of a regional application of pressure or needle or whatever it be that creates an entire structural change. With all stretching, I think it's very important to just take your time. So don't go quickly into a stretch. Sustain it. Take plenty of time to listen as you go. Tune into all the things that are happening as you're working with yourself.
So you said earlier about the fascia being made up of these fibroblasts, and is there a way to, or do you believe, or do we know, is there a way to stimulate these fibroblasts to develop? um, to build fascia? Can we build fascia like a muscle? And does it have anything to do with the fibroblasts? And um, what practices or techniques would you think would do that? The slow moving or more strenuous?
Yes, that's an interesting question. What's going on in the microenvironment? Certainly, movement is the stimulus, but are specific kinds of movements more stimulating than others? And I don't know the answer to that question. This would be an interesting question to ask Trish, actually. She may have more insights.
When I talked to Trish, she was mostly talking about very slow movements and how that stimulated the um, interstitium, like the micro fascia. Mm. And so and I'm interested in that, and I will ask her about that. But I'm also interested in more of the, like, the jumping, like the parkour or like the hard external styles of Kung Fu Tai Chi. It's like these, because obviously that's doing something too, but to a different part of the fascia, maybe.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I really don't have any idea, but I like the question a lot.
Yeah.
It's very interesting because it comes down to there's so many different conditioning techniques that are applied, and
Right.
sometimes just applying the technique, you don't really know what you're conditioning. What are you conditioning for?
Right.
Uh, but I think
Right.
it's always a really good question to ask and investigate.
Well, because we see the Tai Chi practitioners, especially these high level people, and it seems like, the general understanding of Tai Chi is very slow, passive type of practice, but then we find out actually it's not. They're also doing more dynamic aspects to the practice as well. And it's not this kind of, even our understanding of them relaxing, you still have teachers misunderstanding that idea, and where they're slumping and it just looks heavy. It doesn't have this springy quality like what you witnessed, that it takes more than just slow movement to acquire that. There's something else going on. They're doing other practices as well, that's not just this relaxation as we understand relaxation.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And particularly mentioning the word springy, because if you would say, if you do all the Tai Chi training techniques, what kind of conditioning effect are you expecting? What are you doing all those techniques for, all those training techniques? And the answer would be springy. You want the whole body to be springy. And, even metaphorically, they talk about Tai Chi and finding the eternal springtime, but they're talking about that springiness that's very characteristic of young bodies. They sort of have it naturally, but that's the characteristic, that's the property you're trying to cultivate with all this conditioning. And again, I find it a really interesting viewpoint because it's not a cosmetic quality, because a springy body really doesn't look any differently until you see it move or you feel it, and then it's very different. But you're not going for a six pack, you're not looking for, a ripped biceps or whatever.
Right. Right.
And the other interesting thing about that is it's not possible to have a springy body in just one part. It's like my right arm is really springy. I got that down, it's the whole body is springy or not. I also think that, the piezoelectric char- um, properties of fascia is also very interesting. And they know that kind of facilitates bone growth and various healing processes, but it may be involved in other things that we don't understand. Piezoelectric qualities of fascia and this, what you could call in biomechanics, slow loading techniques, which if you translated that into an activity, you would say like Tai Chi. where you're slowly loading the structure in different ways in gravity. Very stimulating to piezoelectric uh, phenomenon in the fascia, which guides bone growth, among other things. So the connection between bone density and Tai Chi is very interesting because it's not just weight bearing. You know, you don't get the same effect just from walking, and obviously you're weight bearing. You don't get the same lower limb effect from walking as you do from practicing Tai Chi. So what's going on there? That's what, Trish is kind of trying to investigate in her work. What's the mechanism?
Hmm. Well, in Tai Chi, we're constantly concerned with this idea of give and take, this idea of rebounding and receiving, or pushing and
Right,
giving inside the
right.
body, which again is the springy quality, as you said.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
And if you're just a casual walker or hiker and you've lost that springy quality, just walking's not going to get you to regain it. You have to practice it.
This is a little tangential, but what you just said reminded me of something else, which is kind of interesting, looking at our bodies and development through the evolutionary process. And
Mhm,
Lieberman, kind of an evolutionary
mhm,
anthropologist, I guess you would call him,
mhm. Daniel
he
Lieberman.
says that, yeah, running came before walking in humans. So that
Yeah.
springiness that's required for running uh, was something that was conditioned our body in a different way than this later advance of the pendulum efficiency of walking, which
Mhm,
requires, a certain terrain to be really efficient. So it has to be pretty flat and uniform to
mhm.
really have the pendulum efficiency of walking. Whereas the springy energy storage and return of running, you can pretty much do that anywhere.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to
Yeah.
look at Tai Chi as a slowed down running phenomenon,
Mhm.
right? You're bending and
Yes.
unbending the legs, you're storing and releasing energy. Very, very different type of movement than walking.
That's right. And then, so I'm a runner myself, and I can, since I've got into these different uh, practices, I've noticed how many people run heavy versus springy. You can
Yep.
see it walking down the street. If somebody's running heavy or running springy, and somebody that's running heavy isn't going to recover springiness by continued running. It also seems like there's something with the flat terrain and the big cushy shoes where it's doing the work for you. Like there's an arch support where, if we come back to Tai Chi, we're talking again the plantar fascia, bubbling well. Sometimes I've heard it translated as bubbling spring, but I don't think that the connection between springy and spring. Uh, so do you see the connection there in the foot?
Oh, absolutely. And this leads me to one of my rants, for lack of a better word, about footwear and how footwear trends, shall we call them, are kind of wrecking our health in much the same way as sitting in chairs does. And that I really, really emphasize to my Tai Chi students to just wear the most minimal shoes you can that just protects your feet from environmental hazard like stepping on something on the floor, as opposed to thinking your shoes can enhance your performance, because they can't. So shoes can really screw up the ground reaction force that our body needs, both to organize but also to condition. So I think because of footwear, we live in a world of very, very deconditioned feet, and wearing those shoes, as you said, those big running shoes, the condition isn't going to happen in the body wearing those, and you will never have the springy because it's not the correct information for your body to receive about direction of ground reaction force, which is what you need to for that rebound, that springiness. So gravity pushes us down, ground reaction force is the opposing force, and a good runner knows how to be so efficient with moving from the ground reaction force. And the heavy runners that you describe are just people that are only moving in one way, gravity down, and they're not communicating with the ground reaction force at all through their bodies, right? So it's very laborious and not particularly healthful, I would say, pretty stressful because they're not conditioning for the storage of the ground reaction force that allows for that springy return.
Oh, that was so well put. I really enjoyed that. I fully agree with everything you said. So let me ask you this then. So I've seen a lot of runners also, shed the shoes, but not return the springiness to their structure, not even know they're looking for it necessarily. They just take the shoes off because they've heard it's
Right.
good for them. I feel like here Tai Chi has something to offer to find that again through the internal principles that we have and that we find in Tai Chi. There's a opportunity to recover that and discover that rebound force. And am I on the right track there with my thinking?
Yes, I think it's helpful. It's interesting when you see a whole field of runners, like in the Olympics or when the marathon starts and you get that big pan of the original field. If you're an Alexander Technique teacher who's used to analyzing people's use of themselves, as they say, or more crudely, we could say their posture, you pretty much know who's going to do well in that race by the first glance. You can see the efficiency and the springiness of the runner that's going to be able to do it. So the precise requirements for what we call in Tai Chi body shape, the precise requirements of how and where you put weight into your lower limbs, into your feet, I think are very useful principles for anybody moving around on our planet. The rules of the game are the same. We have gravity and ground reaction force, that doesn't change. But how we utilize them, that's where training makes all the difference. So I'm not a runner. I've never studied running, so I don't know the different training techniques that runners engage in. You may be able to speak to that, being a runner yourself.
Well, I see it entering in the last few years. You're seeing these running coaches getting on the fascia train, or coaches that were thinking along fascia lines but didn't use the word. So more plyometrics, more springiness with their runners, stiffer ankles, stiffer plantar fascia, more instead of like you've seen the studies, I think 5 to 10 years ago, they start rolling out where, hey, stretching right before a race or a game could be detrimental. Right. And so there's a reperceiving of the body seems to be taking place in a lot of different fields. And I think running obviously is going to be there as well. But just with the biomechanics and the practice of Tai Chi, it's just like you said, it's such an old tradition. And a lot of the stuff, it seems to be baked into the idea of these practices and these internal principles, that the sophistication, I don't know, like even Alexander is quite sophisticated, but compared to the Qigong Tai Chi, it's a rather new tradition.
Sure, absolutely. Well, and one of the things about the Tai Chi traditions, it wasn't equipment focused.
Mhm.
It wasn't
Yeah,
footwear focused. So that's kind of a
right.
hard sell these days. Like one of the first
Yeah.
questions people have when they come to new class, well, what kind of shoes should I buy? Which It's just kind of funny. It's like, well, just like a cheap pair of Keds that doesn't have any art support or something, that'd be
Yeah.
perfect. You know?
Yeah.
So, but so much of, humans are so funny because we love equipment. We love our toys, and the more
Yes.
expensive the running shoe is, the more we're convinced it's going to help us.
Right.
It's the shoe that's going to do it.
Yeah. Well, and that brings me to the Tai Chi again, Alexander. There's a crossover here too, but even when I see a lot of people training fascia in gyms and stuff like this, there's still this. We're going to enter into the realm of consciousness for a second here. There's a sense of perspective, like a first person internal perspective, or looking at the body externally as kind of an object and running it through its
Right.
paces.
Yeah.
Yeah, could you sort of speak on the internal principles of Tai Chi?
I think what pretty much defines the Western world, this is going to be a dramatic statement that will probably get me in trouble,
Yeah.
is the is the mind body division that
Yeah.
has persisted uh, robustly and expressed in philosophers who were given a lot of real estate in our thinking, shall we say. Descartes, of course, comes to mind, but uh, even if we look at modern medicine, you have lots of specialty medicine, but among all of those specialties, you don't have a myologist. That would be a doctor who specialized in muscles. They don't exist because all that structural stuff that is sort of packaging was viewed as packaging for a long time is not really worthy of much exploration. It's kind of packaging, doesn't have much intelligence, whereas you get into the organs, the heart, the kidneys, the digestive system. Now there's something you can really delve into. So it's amazing how much we don't know about our structure in terms of how muscles really do function, how connective tissue really does function, and how this support matrix, which not only supports us, but also moves us around, how it all functions together. And you bring up this idea of consciousness within the body, where we've been limited for a long time thinking that consciousness is something that is in our brain, and our body is sort of the robotic appendage of the brain. And the idea of intelligence being distributed all through our body and consciousness being exhibited all through our body is not a mainstream idea of Western culture. It's gaining more traction, but interesting in the East, those rigid uh, differentiations never took hold, that mind and body were separate.
So I'm saying in a lot of these practices that are coming over, traditions that are coming over, including meditation and all these kind of embodied practices, that sense of perspective is implicit. Uh, it's I find that it's rarely even addressed because it's just assumed, and then we come up into a Western practitioner and there's a disconnect because, as you said, it's robustly external.
Yeah. Yes, and I think the idea of practice in the Eastern disciplines, it's just assumed that it's mind, body, soul all together, however you want to say it, mind, body, spirit, that you don't practice with just your body, or you don't practice with just your mind. You practice with everything. You practice with everything who you are. And I certainly embrace that idea. And I think that idea is still a little distant in Western culture. I think one of the areas where it really manifests so strongly is in the psychotherapy communities, where uh, talk therapy is generally so isolated from uh, the physical person. And and again, It can be a very, very, psychotherapy can be a very, very long process of change where people are involved in years, years and years. And I wonder if there was a physical component that was just incorporated naturally into that, if that would allow the process to move more.
Yeah, I think we're seeing this in embodied therapy and somatic therapy. Peter Levine comes to mind.
Yes.
Uh, yeah, we're seeing that emerging. Mm, yeah, and so I think the fascia, and let me know your thoughts on this. There's an opportunity here because it's holistic. Like when we're working on, when external consciousness is uh, object focus in parts, right? I can focus on building biceps or speed or whatever. But when we're working with these Tai Chi practices, Qigong practices, and we're working with meridians or fascial lines, because the system is holistic, it requires a different type of awareness.
Yes.
I can't just focus on a joint and forget about the rest of my body. It requires the practitioner to be fully embodied, to engage in these practices in the way they're meant to be.
Yes, I think that's a really important point, is that training is really about training awareness. What are you paying attention to? So
Mm-hmm.
physical training without that is very limited in terms of how much a
Mm-hmm.
person will develop as a result of it. How easily
Mm-hmm.
will they be injured if they're not paying attention, if they're not conditioning their awareness with as much attention as they are, quote unquote, conditioning their body. And I would say too that awareness training is probably what sets one teacher apart from another. The best teachers I've
Mm-hmm.
had in any discipline, and there's lots of physical disciplines as well as manual therapy disciplines that I studied, the outstanding teachers were the ones who could guide my awareness. Pay attention to this. Did you notice that? That's the mark of a good teacher, whether you're teaching running or Tai Chi or Alexander
Mm-hmm.
technique or French or I don't think it
Mm-hmm.
matters.
Yeah. So then can we say, was it the same way in traditional Tai Chi, or was that, like we said before, just implicit? They're just doing that, or are we saying that this practice has the potential to create that in the person, this type of awareness, or both?
Yes, I think again with Tai Chi, what has to be understand is the whole scope of the training system. So
Mm-hmm.
in the Western exposure to Tai Chi, they basically think of Tai Chi as a solo movement form that's performed slowly by yourself, sort of
Mm-hmm.
meditative and dance-like. And that's it. That's what Tai Chi is. Doesn't involve
Mm-hmm.
any meditative techniques. It doesn't involve fast training. It doesn't involve training with a partner. It doesn't involve footwork drills. It doesn't involve weapons. It
Yeah.
doesn't, uh, so the whole scope of the system needs to be appreciated to answer that question that you ask, in that Tai Chi training is also mind training. It's also body training
Mm-hmm.
of equal rigor.
Mm-hmm.
Yin Yang theory is a foundation of all the Tai Chi system of training. So this idea of not excluding the opposite. So if you do moving practice, you need to do the same
Mm-hmm.
amount of still practice. If you do
Mm-hmm.
meditation, you need to do the same amount of uh, physical movement, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That concept of the whole thing, the whole yin and yang,
Mm-hmm.
is what makes training complete. Again, is very missing in Western concept of training systems, where you
Right.
balance weightlifting with aerobics.
Right.
Not exactly. No, that's not gonna be the yin yang of training.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Recovery is just becoming more and more of a practice for most athletes, I think, in the last decade or so. That really wasn't talked about too much
yeah,
20
and
years
I
ago.
think recovery techniques are fascinating. I'm really
Hmm.
drawn to them. And certainly because I've invested, considerable amount of time personally with them, like the Tai Chi still practice,
Right.
it's like having an amazing medicine chest that
Yeah.
you can reach into when you need it. Okay, so I really wrenched my knee. What do I need to do? This kind of still practice. And it's
Yeah.
amazing how the body is the recuperative processes of the body, or what I call the self-correcting healing processes, just they're right there for you if you give them the opportunity to function.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not just take a day off and lay
Right,
around.
exactly. Don't take the anti-inflammatories and put your feet up.
Right. Right. Watch TV.
Right. That's not going to initiate
Yeah.
the healing process in the same way.
Well, this has been really great, Holly. I appreciate you coming on. I feel like we just scratched the surface here.
Well, I really appreciate your mission here with your somatic project. It as a just providing some new insights and access to information to people who really are interested in salutogenesis, really are interested in finding ways to be healthier, be more balanced human beings. So it's really great to have a way to work with technology and make that information more accessible to people.
Hmm. Yeah, thanks.
So I really, yeah, I commend you for that.
All right.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you
Holly.
so much.
Have a
Yeah,
good day.
bye bye.
Bye bye.